You ever build something for one purpose and then when circumstances change, you ultimately have to use it in an entirely different way? Well, I did. This was originally meant to be a TV stand with a soundbar insert. And then when we moved houses, our new layout does not allow for this to be used as an purpose, and it has evolved into a sort of entryway table. But it was too nice of a piece not to put together a build video for. So we hope you enjoy and stay tuned as we build this TV stand entryway table thing. You might have seen us work with a few oak natural edge slabs in some of our previous videos. Well, back when we were living in Texas, there was a local guy that was running a sawmill on his back 40 and offering up slabs at crazy good prices. I'm talking too good to ignore prices. So I picked up a couple slabs for the coffee bar cabinet we built. And then when that was done, I was apparently still glutton for more punishment and thought I would dive into another slab top cabinet build. This time, a TV console that would also hold our soundbar was the idea that I had in mind. So I picked the slab I thought would be best for the cabinet size I was looking for and started flattening it out with a quick and dirty flattening jig I had built for my router. Now I believe I have mentioned it in our last slab build, but just in case I didn't, I will say it now. Do not underestimate the time it will take you to flatten a slab using a router and a jig. You can do it, but if you have a local shop near you that has a CNC or a planer big enough for your slab, I highly recommend you reach out to them and see if they would let you use it for a fee. Trust me, it will save you time. I'm talking weeks, if not months. Now, if you are crazy like me, you're going to be spending a lot of time pushing your router back and forth on this sled, leveling it out, your slab, one pass at a time. You'll see here that even before I was finished flattening the slab, I did a small epoxy pour at the joint where the trunk of the tree split off into a branch. I did this because that area had a bark inclusion that I wanted to preserve and not risk destroying while I was running the router over it. This epoxy pour, while critical to preserving the integrity of the wood around the inclusion, also led to the rapid dulling of the router bit I was using. Future Josh here. If you do decide to flatten your own slab with your router, please invest in a high quality bit for this. Learn from my mistakes. I used a decent one when we built the coffee bar nook, but I cheaped out when I bought one for this build, and it ended up costing me a lot of time, tear out, and burning. I ultimately went back to the older bit, even though it had dulled some, and used that to finish out this piece because it was just way better than this one. So learn from my mistakes and save yourself some heartache. Once the slab was mostly flattened, I did a few more small epoxy pours to fill in some voids and chip out areas around the bark inclusion. I then busted out my scraper tool I have to knock down the overpour areas of the epoxy and bring things back down to flat on the slab. Next, it was on to both of the natural edges. There was still some bark on each edge, so I stood the slab on its side and began the process of removing it. I first started with my angle grinder and a rough sanding disc, working on the larger, flatter portions of the edge. I took my time, trying not to remove too much material and preserving as much of the natural shape as I could. When the large portions of the edge were cleaned up, I moved on to my Dremel tool to get into the narrow areas and work on fine-tuning any spots that needed it. With cleanup on the slab top accomplished, I then moved on to building the body of the cabinet. First step was to break down the sheets of plywood I had into more manageable pieces. Now, a track saw is perfect for cutting plywood sheets, especially if you do it often. But they are expensive, and personally, I haven't felt the need to bite the bullet and purchase one yet. For those of you like me, you can use a level or a straight edge clamped to your plywood sheet and get a cut with tolerances tight enough for cabinetry. You could even go a step more advanced and use a scrap piece of plywood to make a guide custom fit for your circular saw. I've done that since recording this, but for the sake of this build, it was not used. Now, I am someone who typically believes in mounting your shelves in a specific location in your cabinets, because, let's be honest, no one changes the positioning all that often, if ever. That said, for this TV stand slash future entryway table thing, I was not entirely sure what all would be stored in the lower portions of this cabinet. And so, for the added flexibility to change my mind in the future, or for my wife to change hers, I used the shelf pen jig to drill out holes in all the internal sides of the cabinet, allowing for the shelves to be repositioned with ease. The original intent for this build was a TV stand, and at the time, I knew we wanted to be able to store our soundbar in a perfectly designed to fit slot at the top. But a critical part of that, and any other electronics we chose to store in this cabinet, would be cable routing out the back of the cabinet. As such, I planned for a slot behind the soundbar that would not only allow cables to reach out the back of the cabinet, but would also be large enough to allow me to store a surge protector power strip back there. I used a Forstner bit to drill a hole in each of the corners, and then I went back and used a jigsaw to cut out the entire slot. So continuing with our cable management, this is the soundbar shelf next that we're doing cable management through. We've got our 3 separate compartments. There's going to be a 15 inches wide shelving area on the right, a 15 inches wide shelving area on the left, and a 30 inches wide shelving area in the middle. With that said, I've now drilled 3 holes using the same Forstner bit to allow cables from each of those different areas, if we need something plugged in, to be able to run up into the soundbar shelf area, which is where the power strip, like I said, is going to be plugged in. So we should be good with cable management with those. With all the plywood cut down and our cable routing planned out, it was on to one of the least exciting but most practical parts of a basic cabinet build: pocket hole joinery. I drilled out pocket holes for our main soundbar shelf, as well as the sides, back, bottom, and each of the dividers for the lower section. Pocket holes are simple, effective, and as you will see in a little bit, you can use a simple trick to help conceal them if you don't want them to be seen. After planning out joinery for the base of the cabinet, it was finally time to start assembly, probably one of the most satisfying middle stages of any build, where you first start to see the project come to life. I started by assembling the back, bottom, and sides of our cabinet. I want to take a second to thank you for watching and ask that if you enjoy this video, please drop us a like, a comment, or subscribe to our channel to help us grow. With that, I will leave you for a minute to watch this build come together.
Tell me up and you say it's all for the best. I will show you the way. It's not how it's done, at least not for me, 'cause I need my freedom.
Next, flip the whole thing upside down and cut 4 spacer blocks to hold my soundbar shelf at the appropriate distance from the top so that it would perfectly fit my soundbar. Screwed that in place, and then I moved on to installing the dividers.
Need to figure out a way to love like we did before. Like we did before.
Flipping the cabinet back over, I moved on to installing dividers for the shelving in the lower portion of the cabinet. I cut a spacer block that allowed me to ensure both the side compartments of the cabinet were square and identical.
Before. Like we did before.
I previously mentioned a trick for hiding your pocket holes. It's a relatively simple method where you cut dowels the exact diameter of your pocket holes to the length slightly longer than the hole itself, usually around 2 to 2.5 inches or so. Give them a light coat in wood glue and then pound them into the pocket holes with a mallet. I'm using my Nordic carved wooden dead blow mallet. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see how I designed and built it. The joints are still somewhat visible, typically because of a difference in the grain pattern, but as long as you use the same species of wood, it's a lot less noticeable to an inexperienced eye. Once the glue is dry, you can come back with a flush trim saw and quickly cut off the excess dowel, leaving a flush patch over your unsightly pocket hole. This has become my go-to method for concealing pocket holes in areas where you might otherwise notice them. That said, the pocket holes on the back and bottom of this cabinet will never be seen once it is in place, and so I didn't bother concealing those. Edge banding plywood is a simple trick to add a lot of visual quality improvement where layered plywood edge might be seen in the finished product. The banding comes in large pre-glued rolls that can just be ironed on, and then you can trim away the excess overhang with a razor blade. Now, most of the plywood edge of this cabinet I'm going to be covering up with 3/4 inch oak fascia boards, but both the shelves and this cutout in the back will be exposed edges, and thus we'll get some edge banding.
Next, given the weight of the slab top on the cabinet, I didn't want for the support to be limited to just the edges on the back and sides, so I added 2 support pieces of plywood to help distribute the weight more evenly. The front support piece also served the dual function of providing me a place to mount the oak fascia to. Moving on to the oak fascia of the cabinet body, I started by first building the exterior frame of fascia around the sides, top, and bottom. The reason I did this first was to ensure that the remaining pieces of fascia would line up exactly as I wanted with the soundbar shelf and dividers built into my cabinet. I could do this by taking my exterior fascia frame and clamping it to the body so that I could mark exactly where the internal pieces needed to be.
So to get this flush, I have set up this front fascia piece to be perfectly flush with this shelf using a piece of wood to make sure it's perfectly flush. And then I set up my clamp over here as a stop so this can't shift down. So now all I got to do is make sure that I'm flush in the front. And once I get one in place on each side, I can remove the fascia and add in the second one.
By pulling the fascia frame off the cabinet body, I was then able to fully secure the middle slat with the additional screws on each side. Next, I went ahead and repeated the process for the vertical struts for each of the dividers. With the full face frame finally assembled, I mounted it onto the body of my cabinet, once again using pocket holes that I had pre-drilled before assembly. These are another set of pocket holes in the interior of my cabinet that I'm going to come back through and conceal using the dowel method that I described earlier.
Jumping back to our slab top for the cabinet, I saw in several other videos put out by the great Cam Anderson of Blacktail Studio that instead of leaving his cut table edges at your standard 90 degrees to the top surface, he likes to chamfer the top edge of them and then have a slight angle on the bottom portion of the side. Now, I don't have nearly the tools or the setup that Blacktail Studio does, and this is not something I've ever tried before, but I figured I would give it a go. So you see me here with my slab top upside down and using my circular saw at about a 20-degree angle to cut through both ends of the slab. As you can see, given my inexperience with this technique, I got a little burning from the saw blade on the wood in the middle. A lesson learned for next time, and I will work on the charring when I get to clean up. Now, I could have used my chamfer bit in my router to hit the top edges of the slab on the sides, but I must have been feeling some type of inspiration to try new things. After all, this whole side edge idea was stolen from Cam. So instead of doing that, I decided to jump back in time and do things the old-fashioned way, busting out my little Stanley block plane and chamfering the edge by hand. I don't recommend this unless you are experienced with hand tools or if you're only doing a slight chamfer. As the deeper you go, the harder it gets and the more likely you are to cause chip out if you hit the edge from the wrong direction. Following some sanding and cleanup, the top slab of my cabinet was ready for finish. Going into this project, I decided to use Rubio Monocoat as my finish of choice. I like the natural look it leaves on the wood without changing the color, and I thought it would be ideal to highlight the contrast between the wood and the blue epoxy I was using. Looking back now, I don't regret my choice in finish. I still very much like it for all of those reasons, but I probably won't be using it on complex shaped cabinets in the future either. The spread on and wipe off application of Rubio just took far too much time for getting it on every surface inside of the cabinet. For tabletops and flat surfaces, I would choose it again in a heartbeat. But for cabinets, I probably would go back to my older methods with something that I can spray on a single coat outside of my shop in a matter of minutes. These days, with busy family life and work, time is my most valuable resource. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Well, I hope you enjoyed the nice finishing backdrop for this rant. But let's get back to the rest of the build. When I had finished finishing the body and top of my cabinet, try saying that 3 times fast while recording yourself. This took several takes. I moved on to mounting the hardware for my double sliding doors. Now, this was just a kit that I bought on Amazon. There are dozens out there with different looks and styles, so I won't bother you with a link to any specific one. The most important part of mounting this is to make sure that the bar your cabinet doors will roll on will be perfectly level. If it is not, your doors are not going to stay in place wherever you position them, and it will be infuriating. The other big thing is that this is right on the front of your piece, so if you mess it up, it will be highly visible to fix. No pressure. Really, all in all, it wasn't that bad, and it was just a couple of screws that I put spaced appropriately, and the bar was set up. Slapping this slab on top of the cabinet body was no joke, as the thing weighed a good bit. And I needed to get my wife to help me carry it over and set it in a position without getting glue everywhere. Once the slab was in place, I temporarily clamped it down so that I could insert screws from the cabinet body up into the slab. Since the slot for our soundbar was pretty narrow, I ended up needing to use a right angle attachment for my driver to insert the screws. If you don't have one of these handy attachments, I recommend them. You don't need them very often, but at the few times when you really do, they are a headache saver. With the body and top assembled, the final pieces to worry about were the doors, which meant it was time for another slab. Since you've already seen me work on one slab in this build, I'll speed things up a bit for this one. I selected an oak slab that I thought would go well with this piece, cleaned up the edges a bit, and then I took it outside to rip a straight cut through it with my circular saw. This was done for 2 reasons. The first was that I wanted both sliding doors to be made from 2 pieces of wood with a river running between them. The second was that since I cut the width of my pieces down, it meant I could actually plane the pieces instead of using my homemade router sled. Score 1 point on that front for time saving. Next, it was over to the miter saw with some quick chopping down the length until I had 4 pieces, each slightly longer than I needed the height of my cabinet doors to be. It was almost time for the epoxy rivers, but before I went into that, there were a few minor cracks and holes in the faces of my pieces that I wanted to make sure were filled. I decided to try mixing some of the blue mica powder I was using with some CA glue for a quick filler. I think it turned out alright for the small voids, but in the future, I might just stick with a quick drying epoxy if I need it. I put my pieces into some melamine forms I custom made for the doors, and I began pouring my epoxy river. If you have followed this channel, you probably know that while I have done some smaller epoxy fills, I've never attempted a full river before. It's not that I don't think epoxy can be used in woodworking. It's just not my standard style for most of my projects. But this one was about trying something new and building a statement piece for the center of our living room. For those reasons, I did things a little differently than some of the bigger channels out there. Everyone will tell you to use deep pour epoxy for its ability to do everything in a single pour and its self-leveling properties. I didn't have any deep pour epoxy, and I didn't want to drop a ton of money on some just for this build. Instead, I chose to stick with the thicker tabletop epoxy I'm familiar with, and split my total river across 3 different pours. With everything fully cured, I scraped off the excess epoxy with this handy scraper tool I have. Then, it was time to move back over to the table saw to cut down my doors to their exact final dimensions. I ripped the sides of the piece and then used my miter gauge with a fence and some clamps to cross-cut the tops and bottoms even.
With the doors set at their final dimensions, it was time to switch back over to sanding. I worked my way up through the grits to finish at 220 grit. Now here's a tip that I've learned for giving a piece an extra leg up when sanding to make your finish even better. Water pop in between your final grits. You spray the piece down with a light coat of water and let that dry. When it does, it causes the fibers of the wood to stand up and feel rough on the surface of the piece. You then sand those down with your sander and are left with an ultra smooth surface ready for finish. Rubio recommends that you sand to 180 grit and do not go beyond that. I personally like to go up to 220 grit on the piece and then come back for a light hand sanding at 180 to scuff up the surface just enough for the Rubio to bond well. Next came the fun part. It was time to finally see the rivers come to life in my doors as I applied Rubio Monocoat to them. I hope you enjoy the sight as well. When everything was finished, I mounted the barn door hardware to both of my doors, and then I was ready for the big reveal. If you have stuck around this long in the video, I want to once again thank you. You are the audience we are trying to cultivate. We would greatly appreciate it if you dropped us a like, commented, or best of all, subscribe to our channel. We're small time here on YouTube, and your support makes all the difference. Thank you once again.